Yeah, hello and welcome to our second lecture in our lecture series on climate protection in the summer semester 2023. And today we have the topic about climate change and didactics, about education. So for those students who are interested in this field, maybe you're also interested in the lecture which was in 2022 from Franz Rauch about climate and didactics. You'll find the YouTube link on this slide below about the recording. But today we have a special guest from University of Innsbruck, Reingard Spannring, Reingard Spannring studied sociology at the University of Vienna and Sussex in UK and worked as a researcher at the Institute of Advanced Studies and Austrian Institute for Youth and Research in Vienna. Since 2006, she has been at the Institute of Educational Science at University of Innsbruck, where she focuses on animal-human and human-nature relationships from the perspective of sociology, the philosophy of education and learning theories. In her FWF research project from 2019 to 2022 with her Australian colleague, Ji Hawk, I hope I spelled it well, she developed an online learning platform. You'll find the link here on the slide if you're interested in this, to encourage young people to explore their biosocial environment. Systems theory, which is the understanding of complex biosocial relationships, plays a major role in this, as will also be shown in the following lecture. So welcome Reingard Spannring with her lecture on climate change and education on an example of water literacy. Welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here and for the opportunity to discuss my thoughts with you. I have slightly changed the title of my presentation. The subtitle is the example of water literacy and beyond, because my conclusions will be more about the education system more generally than just about water literacy. So I understand that the title of this lecture series is Climate Change and Climate Protection. My project focused on water, on riverscapes, and learning in the context of that. But I think there is a strong connection between water issues and climate change. And I'm easily persuaded by the United Nations, who also say water and climate change belong together. Climate change is primarily a water crisis, they say. We feel its impacts through worsening floods, rising sea levels, shrinking ice fields, wildfires, and droughts. However, water can fight climate change. Sustainable water management is central to building the resilience of societies and ecosystems and to reducing carbon emissions. Everyone has a role to play, the UN says. Let us look at this connection in a little bit more detail. Water and climate change are inextricably linked. Extreme weather events are making water more scarce, more unpredictable, more polluted, threatening sustainable development, biodiversity, and people's access to water and sanitation. Flooding and rising sea levels can contaminate land and water resources and cause damage to water and sanitation infrastructure. Glaciers, ice caps, and snowfields are rapidly disappearing. Meltwater feeds many of the major river systems. Volatility in the cryosphere, that is the frozen water, can affect the regulation of freshwater resources for vast numbers of people in lowland areas. Droughts and wildfires are destabilizing communities and triggering civil unrest and migration in many areas because they exacerbate soil erosion, reduce groundwater recharge, increase water scarcity, and food insecurity. Growing demand for water increases the need for energy-intensive water pumping, transportation, and treatment. It has contributed to the degradation of critical water-dependent carbon sinks, such as peatlands. Water-intensive agriculture for food production, in particular for meat production and for growing crops used as biofuels, can further exacerbate water scarcity. As water issues and conflicts around water become more salient, water literacy has become a widely adopted term. It now appears across diverse fields of scholarly inquiry and is in use in governments, municipalities, funding bodies, and NGOs. Although it is applied variously across these contexts and often lacks a clear definition or description. The most general and unspecified definition refers to water literacy as water-related knowledge. More specific definitions refer to different kinds of cognitive and scientific knowledge sets, attitudes and values, cross-cultural meanings, and individual and collective behavior with respect to water. Overall, there is a strong bias towards anthropocentric water needs, in particular economic needs, and an overemphasis on the cognitive dimension and Western scientific approaches to knowledge, to individualized forms of learning rather than collective learning, and to behavioristic methods of calling forth a certain behavior rather than participative learning. Along with other environmental educators, I suggest strengthening place-based learning, local and hydrosocial knowledge, outdoor experiences that address the learner as a whole person, ethical considerations, interdisciplinarity and systems thinking, and participative learning in a living and learning system. In this presentation today, I will only focus on hydrosocial knowledge, ethical considerations, and the concept of systems thinking, and then I will go back to a more general discussion of education with respect to this notion of participative learning. Hydrosocial knowledge, that is the question, which dimensions has the relationship between humans and water? And I have tried to separate different dimensions and aspects in this little graph. On the one hand, you have the experiential dimension, that is somatic, emotional, cognitive, spiritual relationships with water and rivers. On the other hand, you have the behavioral dimension of individuals, the activities, the movements we can observe. On the lower tier, you have the cultural phenomena, which are about belief systems, value systems, ethics, practices, symbols, and meanings. And on the right-hand side, on the bottom, you have systems and structures like the political system, legal system, the economic system, and of course the educational systems, which play a large role in forming our hydrosocial knowledge and our relationships with water and rivers. Let me give you a very brief example for an experiential phenomenon, how important experience is for us. On which occasions has water or nature amazed you or triggered special emotions in you? And what does that mean for your life and for your relationship to water? I don't expect an answer now, but maybe you want to think about this after the lecture. So emotions, affects are very important for environmental education and the way we deal with somebody else, whoever that somebody is. Could also be a riverscape, as in this picture. Then I will turn to social systems An example is the interrelationship between water, technology, and politics. Water has immense importance in the systems of science, technology, and politics. Water is predominantly seen here as an inert resource over whose control violent conflicts sometimes break out or give power to those who have control over it. Think of the water wheel, the water pump, the canal, the dam. To have control over water by means of these socio-technological objects is also to be able to control people's lives and their living conditions. Thus, ancient great empires such as Egypt and China were already built on the centralized control of the water of their great rivers, which enabled despotic forms of government and society. While the Celts, for example, worked the land with very low threshold technology and hardly interfered with riverscapes and watercourses, the Romans developed a great penchant for water management and built aqueducts and water pipes to supply water to their cities and garrisons. Roads and waterways enforced Roman power and directed all economic production. Water wheels and mills drove ideas and technological developments for the use of water power, which became an essential foundation for economic growth. Especially with industrialization, water power became a symbol of man's ingenuity, capable of, quote, taming thousands and thousands of horsepower for the benefit of present and future generations that would otherwise have rushed uselessly down the stream, as was said, for example, at the opening of Elbe River Dam in the USA in 1910. The Kaprun power station in Austria is also an impressive example of engineering skills and economic and political significance. In the economic crisis after World War I, when Austria also lacked coal, among many other things, this hydroelectric plant was planned. When it was completed in 1956, it was seen as a symbol of liberation from the Allies after World War II and the economic upswing of the post-war period. Both examples illustrate not only the technical ability to tame hydropower for human benefit, but also the political exercise of power and the exploitation of nature and other living beings. In the case of the Elbe River, the fish population dwindled dramatically. In particular, salmon, which used to return to the Elbe River by the hundreds of thousands each year, were reduced to 1% of their original population. However, the dam construction also disregarded the land rights of the indigenous people and destroyed their material and cultural livelihood. Only with the demolition of the dam 100 years later, in 2014, was the river community, including Pacific salmon and the indigenous population, able to develop and flourish again. In the case of Kaprun, the dam became a political prestige project for Nazi Germany, opened by Hermann Göring in 1938. Not only local farmers were involved in the huge construction site, but also forced laborers and prisoners of war, many of whom died from accidents, but also poor supplies and equipment. We see from these two cases how ecosystems and animal and human life are sacrificed for economic profit and political power. Let's have a little look at social structures, at structures of inequality and injustice. Drinking water resources and risks associated with water, such as droughts, floods, devastation, water pollution, are highly unevenly distributed globally. This has to do with geographic space, that is water-rich versus water-poor regions, but also to the effects of climate change and a country's political and economic resources. But even within a country, access to water and water infrastructure, as well as risks, are unequally distributed. Poorer and disadvantaged populations often face poorer functioning of drinking water, sanitation, wastewater management, and protection from risks than wealthy areas. One example that illustrates social and political inequality is the lead contamination in drinking water that occurred in Detroit in 2014 and 15. While citizens complained about water quality and children, the sick and the elderly got even sicker, authorities tried to dismiss the complaints as hysterical, and they tried to cover up their shortcomings and failures until an emergency had to be declared and the population had to be supplied with bottled water. At first glance, it appears that the authorities are simply responsible for this crisis. However, when one correlates the myriad cases of pollution, one sees a pattern of social and political processes that lead to the Black and indigenous populations being particularly affected. Linked to the history of racism and colonialism, resources, government assistance, democratic voice, and investment in infrastructure are unequally distributed between the white population on the one hand and the Black and indigenous population on the other hand. For the disadvantaged, this means a poorer provision in terms of schooling, jobs, individual social and environmental health. In this specific case, unrenewed water pipes led to lead poisoning for a predominantly Black population and their environment. Structures of inequality are often interrelated, and here is an example for this interrelationship using meat production to highlight this. In the slaughterhouses, where thousands of or millions of animals suffer and die every day, the employees are also exploited. They have to perform violent work under very poor working conditions, which severely affects their physical and mental health and their communities. At the same time, enormous amounts of water are spent on raising the animals, slaughter, and packaging the meat. Greenhouse gases are produced, agricultural land is over-fertilized, and nitrates, pesticides, and pharmaceuticals enter the groundwater. In addition, animals and animal feed is often imported from overseas, for example, from Latin America, where indigenous people and wild animals lose their homes to big agribusiness. Water as a cultural phenomenon. Water had and has an enormous importance in mythology, religion, and philosophy. In the European Alps, for example, there is a multitude of legends, fairy tales, and religious interpretations of the relations between men and rivers. Cult sites in honor of rivers already existed in the Bronze Age. Also, the Romans worshipped rivers. Probably best known in the Alpine region is Neptune, but also the Sava, the Drava, the Danube, and the Isonzo, or Socha. They were each embodied by a god. The rivers were also often the subject of legends, such as the one about the Drava, Sava, and Isonzo being siblings, competing to see who would reach the sea first. Water also plays an essential role in everyday life in our culture. Think of the importance of baptismal water, water as a remedy and cure, water as a place of recreation and shared activities, for example, barbecuing together at the riverside or bathing vacation Also, a cultural aspect are the ideas and norms of hygiene and cleanliness, or the role of water in architecture, art, and aesthetics. Water, however, is predominantly a consumer good in our society and culture. Discussions about virtual water and the water footprint demonstrate how we use and consume it for our needs. The process of producing goods and consuming them turns something living, that is animals and plants, and life-giving, such as water, into an object that we judge only by its monetary value and utility. We use it and we throw it away. We forget the value that these elements, inorganic substances, and organic life had before, or in their original context, or for themselves, their intrinsic value. Water is not only becoming a purchasable object in the form of drinking water and other goods. In other areas of life, too, water is often treated as a consumer good, for example, in the leisure and tourism industry. Whether it is bathing, swimming, sailing, surfing, canoeing, whitewater paddling, fishing, or skiing. Water and riverscapes are used as recreational spaces and are therefore closely linked to human health and needs, as is drinking water. The fact that we view water and ecosystems almost exclusively from the perspective of their utility to us humans and as consumer goods is typical of our consumer culture. So how does the difference feel between consuming water or a riverscape and actually being in dialogue with it? I took these two pictures at the Krimmel waterfalls, a famous waterfall in Austria, and I could not take a picture of the masses of tourists there. And I was wondering, how is their relationship to this water? Is it just for taking a picture? Is it just for putting on social media where you were? Or is there something else? Is there a dialogue going on? That's just an open question. But it leads me to the question of ethics. Our relationship and interaction with nature is strongly influenced by our ethical understanding of nature. That is, what actions we consider right and appropriate in relation to nature, animals, and water. The environmental and climate crises in particular challenge our modern ideas about nature and the human-nature relationship, especially our idea that humans and nature, or animals and humans, are separate, and nature, water, and animals are only in the world for human benefit. This attitude is called anthropocentrism. By categorically separating nature from culture and animals from humans and presenting them as respective antipoles, it was easy to devalue the other, the non-human. In fact, these dualisms are accompanied by a hierarchization that portrays humans as the pinnacle of evolution, the measure of all things, and rulers over nature and other animals. The permanent and meticulous production of demarcation, devaluation, and functionalization of these happens, often without us being aware of it. For example, linguistically, when we speak about farm animals, or laboratory animals, or meat production and ecosystem services. These words express our functionalization, or it can be expressed through spatial separation. For example, when farm animals are tethered or locked up, when slaughterhouses are out of our sights, so that we are not worried. Human use of space is thought of as neatly separated from nature. Think, for example, of the conflicts that arise when a rooster crows in a residential area, or when wolves and wild boars invade agricultural land. To dig a little bit deeper on this, I would like to show you two short videos. Hang on a moment.
Us. There. Us. There. Us. But aren't we part of the earth? We're all creatures with the same molecules as everything else on the planet. One interconnected ecosystem that keeps us all alive. But we still different. Especially, why do we often feel separate from the earth? In fact, not everyone does. Throughout human history, lots of cultures have viewed their relationship to the earth in other ways. Many still do. And the belief that spirit infused object, nature, and form existence is a fundamental principle of indigenous society. In Taoism, cosmic energy or life force is everything and is constantly seeking harmony balance through all things. Ancient animal civilizations placed the spirit of Pachamama or Mother Earth very center of their world. And today, for many indigenous people, like the Pfluger tribe, the earth is not just a dust from which human beings live. It's the spirit of their people and ancestors, it's their history, it is life itself. This isn't always integrated for people in today's Western societies. The traits of ancient history differ, focusing on spiritual practices and reverence and connection with nature. But when Christianity spread through Europe, Agnes was condemned as pagan and savage. European colonialism gave fortunes views around the hills in places like the Americas and Australia, trafficking indigenous peoples and their ritualism. Since the birth of agriculture, humans have been manipulating the world around and harnessing, providing and selling its natural resources. But under colonization, we became a place to be conquered, dominated, farmed, fished, plundered, and married on a vast scale. Was there any scientific thinking behind our ever increasing control over the natural world? 17th century Europe also. In fact, thought was all the rage then. As French philosopher, René Descartes, civilization, had to take off the enlightenment and brilliant that combines reason, science, and order. A new view of the world emerged, with human beings as thinking, rational masters, and religion as a fundamentally unproven servant. Standing apart from human investigating nature's ultimate questions, dissecting her into smaller and smaller pieces. This brought us great power. And the power comes. The Anthropocene age and people defined by one species, us. And that is billions of years from each 100 years, much of the universe has come to see them as the rulers and center of all life. Today, we are still trying to verify its environment, processes, and biodiversity to power. Our vast sprawling cities have pushed nature out of sight. The world is attempting to meet the urgent challenge of climate change. We can't anything fundamentally change. We still see ourselves as separate from Earth. The Martians hope. Other voices are starting to hear once again. Influenced by the resurgent indigenous people of Pachamama, the living planet people have had no all nature people right to the home and to the museum. Very has successfully fought to have their over. Ancestors people with the same legal rights and person. In an interconnected world, can humans find ways to truly connect to all the world? And we even might suffer on a single idea. Let us look at
Okay, and I'll just make the second step and show you the other video. It's the example of New Zealand. New Zealand granted a river personal rights. So you can see how this rather historic view is put into the present time.
As children were always very brought up with the idea that slavery is sort of learning organisms. And the first thing I'm doing this year, I was very much a personality that was concerned. She's patient, she's consistent, she's persistent. We see the water sort of channel through rocks and it slowly cuts into very creative. And that time she's explored. She's very curious in a way, but she's able to understand how to explain it. My relationship with the river has kind of been my life. I always consider the river being my greatest teacher. Dearest me.
It really is an exciting day for Parliament because this long-standing grievance was brought to an end by the passage of this legislation, and I very much look forward to working with the Kiwi and to seeing this wonderful river repaired and regenerated over the years to come. For a very long time, this country is grappling with the face of additional students, with colonisation, and finally we're opposed to this, and I will say for what it is. They can see us now, because they can see us all that it is. Therefore, we should pay to the name of the legislation.
Okay, I'll stop here. Right, so I think we've got some idea what I mean with by anthropocentrism. What does it mean to go, or what would it mean to go beyond anthropocentrism? The term that we use in philosophy, nature philosophy, is ecocentrism. That is the view or belief that the rights and needs of humans are not more important than those of other living beings, that ecosystems are considered to have intrinsic value. Ecosystems, and of course their inhabitants, have intrinsic value. In other words, having a value of existence in their own right, rather than merely through benefits that they confer on us humans. And ecocentrism provides us with a robust ethical analysis of the impact that humans are having on the community of life on Earth and the physical systems on which all its members are dependent. What does it mean to go beyond dualisms? In fact, the entanglements that we have seen between nature and culture, or nature and society, between the lives of humans, other animals, and ecosystems are so strong that we cannot think of them separately, as we tend to do in our academic disciplines. Nature and culture and humans and animals are connected not only spatially, but also through complex interdependencies, cascading effects, and co-evolution. In relation to animals, research is also increasingly pointing out how strongly we humans are connected to other species, genetically, biologically, and culturally. A number of concepts are increasingly referred to by social scientists who acknowledge these entanglements. Let me introduce you to three of them. There is the complex adaptive systems theory, which I will go into more detail next. But just to mention two other concepts, that is nature cultures, introduced by philosopher Donna Haraway in 2003, and the concept of biosociology by anthropologist Paulson. I think the two last concepts are rather self-evident, so I will just go through some of the characteristics associated with complex adaptive systems. So complex adaptive systems are systems within systems, or we say nested systems. They are non-linear, dynamic, and self-organizing. And they are characterized by cascades, emergence, and co-evolution. And in the next slide, we will see an example for those cascades. Complex adaptive systems seek suboptimal positions on what system theorists call the edge of chaos, in safe operating space, in which no system boundaries or tipping points are crossed, but dynamic change is still possible. Here is an example on my next slide. There is an example of the dynamic self-organization of the ecosystem in Yellowstone Park after humans have reintroduced the wolf.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process that starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way up. An attractive example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1991. We all know that wolves kill species animals, but that's slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolf circle in the 70 years, the number of deer were like top hilltop in the area, and despite efforts by humans to control, they managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They just raised it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer. That was the major. Much more significant, they radically changed the behavior. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they would catch those species, particularly the valleys and gorges. And immediately, those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of peace and willow possible. As soon as that happened, the birds started. The number of songbirds, migratory birds, started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to drink the trees. And beavers, like wolves, ecosystem engineers, they create niches for other species. And the damage they built to live are providing habitats for otters, muskrats, and ducks, fish, and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed prolific, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more maggots. Ravens, tall beagles came around feeling carrying towards them. Bears turned too, and that population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on regenerated shrubs, and the bears reinforced the impact of wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. Here's what was really the wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander the road, the channels narrow, more pools formed, more rivers set, all which great for wildlife. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. The living was the regenerated forest, stabilized the banks so that they can access them, that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there is a tolerant because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transform not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
Okay, that was one example of cascading effects, one of the most important features of complex adaptive systems. I will just briefly say a little bit about another example. Oops. And that is the damming of rivers and clearing of catchment areas as a complex adaptive system. The driver to this human behavior is the human interest in controlling and using water. But what it does, it influences the biosocial self-organization of that system and can cause extreme floods, reduced availability for human and non-human communities. It can cause less water in stream and in estuaries, and it can lead to reduced rainfall in the area, reduced vegetation and desertification. So you can see how this complex system changes, adapting to the influence of the human. And there are several tipping points which are reached when we overstretch natural resource capabilities and the safe operating space of the systems. Systems can always adapt to a certain extent, but once we cross the limits of this space, then we reach tipping points and the whole system can change very rapidly and dramatically. Another tipping point is when we lose the ability to cope with more extreme variations of natural resource availability. And these dynamics can then lead to ecological and social collapse. So the solution would be that we learn to live with a certain extent of chaos and uncertainty, and that we try to find nature-based solutions that do not upset the system beyond its safe operating space. Now that challenges us to start thinking in terms of solving wicked problems in complex adaptive systems. In the face of complex and dynamic interrelationships, we need fundamentally different ways of thinking about democracy, politics, and education, because they confront us with so-called wicked problems. What are wicked problems? System science identifies three broad types of systems. On the one hand, Have a look at the bicycle. Here is an example for engineered or designed systems. Bicycles, cars, watches, rockets, computers are all engineered systems. They are what they are, and they do what they do because they have been designed and built by specialists. We understand these systems very well, or at least the specialists do. But the kind of thinking that is associated with engineered systems, we call it mechanistic thinking, dominates and obscures the fact that there are other systems that do not fare well with this kind of thinking. So we have natural systems that are very different. They include every living being and also stable combinations of living beings and inorganic matter. Trees, humans, snakes, bacteria, and birds make up natural systems. They have all evolved over millions of years to become what they are today. They have not been designed and built by specialists. Forests and coral reefs are collective natural ecosystems. They constantly change and adapt and regenerate themselves, yet they are still a forest or a coral reef. While we can take apart an engineered system and put it together again, such as a bicycle, we cannot take apart a living system without destroying it. Unlike engineered systems, living systems are not merely complicated, they are complex, which means they cannot be explained purely in terms of cause and effect. Finally, we have purposeful human or soft systems. They include all our institutions and organizations, tribes, schools, banks, armies, governments, theater, and sports groups. Purposeful human systems have much in common with natural systems. They evolve, replicate themselves, they adapt, they can die, they are complex. Purposeful human systems also have a lot in common with engineered systems. Whether their members are aware of it or not, most of them have been configured, especially by their dominant elites, often over generations. They are intended to perform at least a minimum set of specific functions. In some human systems, this purpose is explicit. In others, it is at best vague, and sometimes they are disputed. It is impossible, however, to change such a system without first analyzing its purpose and values. Problems that arise from linear system faults, such as a broken bicycle, are called tame problems, whereas problems that arise in complex adaptive systems are called wicked. The main features of wicked problems are the following. There is no definite statement of a problem because it is embedded in an evolving set of interlocking issues and constraints. You only begin to understand the problem when you have developed and tested an interim solution. There are many people who care about or have something at stake in how the problem is resolved, that is, the stakeholders. This makes the problem-solving process fundamentally social rather than technical. Because there is no objectively right answer, because there is no objective version of the problem, there is also no objectively right answer and no definite solution. The constraints on the solution change over time, such as resources or the people who are involved. The problem-solving process ends when you run out of time, money, energy, or some other resource. It does not end when you have found the perfect solution. Instead, the people involved in the problem situation are actively involved in a constant cycle of thinking, acting, and learning together to understand each other's perspectives, to do what they can to make things better, and then evaluate how successful they have been before starting the whole process all over again. So what does that mean for our society and for education? Democracies will only become increasingly just and sustainable if their citizens understand, are committed to, and share a set of purposes and moral and ecological principles. This is most of what the fighting is about, with the young people who take to the streets to demonstrate for new values. Yes? What we are trying to do is build a biosocial community. And it's only when that community has solid agreement on purposes and principles that you can start talking about the concept and the structure of the organization. These purposes and normative principles cannot be handed down from above, but they must be developed through intensive participative processes. This implies that change becomes a learning experience for all concerned, including political leaders and educators. The richest learning takes place in dialogue-rich groups. It begins with action, is shaped by reflection, and leads to further action. Looking at the complex dynamics and deeper roots of the issues we face, be it climate change, species extinction, or water scarcity, and how we need to go about solving these wicked problems, we realize that our education system has great difficulties meeting this challenge. For one thing, education has traditionally been thought of as the transmission of knowledge and skills to the next generation. However, we're only just learning how to understand our problems. This means we have no knowledge base and praxis which we could readily transmit. Education thus needs to prepare students for an unknown future, to develop strategies to mitigate the effects of the damage we inflict on the planet, to minimize more damage, and to preserve and restore what we have left. Education is ill-equipped to step out of the mechanistic and anthropocentric paradigm that goes not only for what is being taught, but also how things are taught. Education explicitly and implicitly reproduces society's beliefs and cultural practices that separate us from nature and legitimize its exploitation. Education teaches within the disciplinary boundaries rather than across it. Education teaches on an abstract level and often fails to connect with students' hands and hearts. That is, with everyday problems, local knowledge, embodied practices, and emotions. Education is more concerned with the needs of the new information economy. This impoverished version of education is convenient to those whose interests are well served by a docile but technically competent public, otherwise unable to think critically or to act as citizens. Insofar as education brings up problems such as water issues or climate change, it tends to apply mechanistic, that is, behavioristic methods that aim at manipulating students' behavior to enact small and partial solutions, such as separating waste or turning off the tap, rather than getting engaged in the web of life as citizens of a biotic community. Against this, the large idea of education extends well beyond neoliberal interpretations of schooling. It even extends beyond formal schooling toward a vision of continuous recreation or co-evolution of education, society, and nature. Many practitioners in environmental education are disappointed at its relative lack of impact over the last decades. but we have to recognize that its values, theory and practice are affected, influenced and constrained by the systems within which it is embedded, these being the broader educational system, and in turn this within the larger socio-economic and cultural systems. As systems perspective takes us from a model of education as one of social reproduction and maintenance towards a vision of continuous co-evolution, where both education, society, and nature are engaged in a relationship of mutual transformation, one which can explore, develop, and manifest sustainability values. In immediate terms, it means working to make the educational institutions as far as possible a microcosm of the emerging sustainable society rather than of the unsustainable society. The leading metaphor is that of a living and learning system rather than as a machine, and this has profound consequences. Thank you.
Let's see, there are some questions. If you want to write something in the chat, you can do so, or you can open the mic. I see at the moment there is no question in the chat. Is there some point of discussion or question in the audience?
Thanks for the great presentation. I don't feel like this changing mindset, right? And requires a certain like spiritual component. And this is the way forward as we're moving forward away from this component in all parts of society, especially in education, becomes more and more unpopular. Maybe a possibility to working fast, but I think to have a fundamentally different view of the tech might be required.
Thank you. Yes, that's a very interesting and I think also tricky question. My Australian colleague was very much into this question because she was raised in the context of communicating with indigenous elders who brought to her attention a lot of that wisdom that Australian Aborigines have, especially with respect to water. And I've sometimes been thinking about this. Can we transfer that knowledge to Europe? Can we transfer it to a Western society? In talking to my students, I had the impression there is also some form of indigenous feeling towards riverscapes. You can connect. Some students who went out to discover their riverscape at home said, "Oh, this river means home for me." So there is a larger dimension to this, and this is what I would call spiritual. On the other hand, I see this tendency of the far right grabbing ideas of indigenous people and using it for their own nationalistic intentions, and I'm very concerned of that too. So yeah, there is a potential field, I would say. Where is it appropriate? In what way is it appropriate? Also with the corona pandemic, I thought, oh my God, there is so much anti-science in this, and people argue with their guts, not acknowledging scientific knowledge, and so yes, it's a difficult question, I think. But yes, thanks for raising it. I think we need to keep talking about that. Thank you.
I also about what is philosophy. Why we are talking always about water scarcity when roughly 1% of our planet is water? Why we are talking always about water scarcity?
Because we have less and less water that is drinkable or usable for humans. A lot of it is polluted, or it's because of the rising sea levels, it's contaminated with salt, or other debris because of the dust that takes along the whole pieces and importations. So a lot of water is not usable.
Is there any plan for converting that water to usable water?
Can you say again, please?
Is there any plan for converting that usable water to usable water?
Yes, of course, and each country has infrastructure to do that. But I think the problem is in poorer countries who do not have the financial means and technology to do that on the scale that would be necessary. Or even investing in infrastructure that prevents flooding, for example.
Thank you.
Question from my side, I think when you talk about different learning systems and how to change them, I think it's also a problem of time scale. Also, I think we have a chance to change our society and learning system, living systems, but it's a long time scale. I assume it takes 3 or 4 generations to have a really big change in mind and values and all this. And the change in our ecosystem is much shorter time scale. We talk about even a time scale of 50 years, 20 years, so it's really rapidly ongoing. So how do you see what chances do we have in the changing the system and the mindset and the ecosystem, the speed of changing the ecosystem?
Yeah, I'm worried about the same thing actually. Yes, I think that how the social change might be which is strange, isn't it? Because ecological change have taken much more time and many people as society take time to change. I think we might be late. But then change is not slowly uniform. And maybe we have areas and regions where people are more impacted and they actually so necessary for them to save themselves. So change will happen in that way. Or in other ways, we will be impacted, for example, with this experience from the pandemic that production change and delivery change on couple. Maybe that will have an impact on how we organize our economy. So I think there might be regionally different systems who have more or less time to adapt or to change. But generally, my rather pessimistic view that our society is going to change because the external pressures. So, yeah, and from university, I don't know what you think. You think we will manage?
Yeah. But changes of values and economy, they have listened to the very last lecture of this lecture series, and this question of how to change the economy. Other questions? Some questions? Are there questions from the online participants? Just write in the chat or open the mic. You can just directly connect. Not the case. So yeah. there's no further discussion or remarks, I would say thank you very much for participating. Thank you very much for coming and for your interesting lecture.
Thank you very much to you.
Thank you.